hopefully we're all going to make a big dent on crime and that our communities get safer, workers feel safer. We're going to solve with intelligence. We're going to solve with giving the right tools, connecting the dots, going after the worst offenders, and putting a cost back into the crime. And if Axon and Auror are able to do that, then I think in a few years we'll see dramatic improvements into our customers' lives and for our communities.
You're listening to the Retail Crime Intelligence Podcast by Auror, where we share actionable insights to help you reduce crime and violence in your stores.
All right, we've got a pretty heavyweight crew up here, so we will get started by going down the line, introducing yourself, your role, and your unique position to retail crime in your area. Raul, kick us off.
So good morning, Raul Aguilar. I'm the Senior Director of Law Enforcement Partnerships here at Auror, having joined 2 years ago where I was leading the National Initiative on Organized Retail Crime for the Department of Homeland Security. If you're wondering why HSI would have cared about organized retail crime with so many other crimes related to, financial crime and child exploitation and terrorism, it's because of the threat and violence that was happening across the country at the time and the amount of money that's associated with the fraud and the scams and the theft. And so that was one of the initiatives that I led. It was an honor to do it, and that led me here to Auror now for about 2 years, so it's a pleasure.
Hello, I'm Brian Wilson. I'm Deputy Chief of Operations for the Anchorage Police Department, and I'm probably uniquely situated because I was responsible for signing the Axon contract, which then led us to Auror and created a retail crime unit, which is at the patrol level in our department. So.
Jason Fisher, Innovation Manager at the Redmond Police Department, just east of Seattle. I am not law enforcement officer, but I do play with all the new innovative technology and solutions. So we're trying to put together a regional approach to see if we can't solve organized retail theft through the Retail Crime Hub.
Oh, hey everybody, my name is Arjun Subramanian. I'm the Head of Product and R&D for Axon's Enterprise Products Division. We're really responsible for taking all of the cool technology that we've been building all over the world now to large enterprise customers. We sit in the intersection of public safety and safety on our shared spaces and businesses and so on. And so we're very excited to talk to you about, what we've learned in our journey along with some of our early PD partners. And also really grateful for the folks both on, the retail side, on private enterprises that are trusting us now with new products, and for the PDs that have worked with us now for many decades, trusting the safety of their communities with us.
Has anyone got any builds to that on what has been some of the historical challenges between retail and law enforcement?
I'm happy to talk about that for a second. Even REI, so we had an Organized Retail Crime Association group stood up. It was kind of sponsored-ish by the PD. We had a couple champions of that, but when those champions moved on, it kind of fell apart or whatever. And you kind of got to keep that group to the dedicated individuals, because a lot of consumers like to come in there as far as retailers that just want information, don't want to engage. And so kind of shepherding that takes some time. But one of the challenges between retail and law enforcement is retailers have often taken the approach of, got a problem, call the police. And when the police are under-resourced, we can't always respond in the time that a retailer would like. Unfortunately, we're not firefighters waiting for a disaster to happen in the station. We have to stack those calls, and oftentimes it's a slower response. And there's a lot of things that the retailer can do on the front end to make that a more successful story as far as holding those folks accountable. And so that's always been a challenge too.
I can jump in real quick. So from my prior experience, the other reason we joined and started to, at the ground level, work with the retailers first. That's the first thing we did at Homeland Security. We went out and worked with the investigators looking at these networks, who was being impacted, and then figure out where were the silos of information being lost. And at the state and local level, it's exactly what the Deputy Chief just said. Too many priorities, too many incidents, not enough cops, and where does that information just sit and not be used? So some of the things we did is we offered up our traditional centers of excellence to look at the data, look at the investigations from the retail perspective, amplify that with federal resources, looking at travel patterns, looking at their money being moved in and out of banks, sending that back to a prosecution team in the field, working hand in hand with some of the largest retailers, and then those investigative packages were going out to prosecutors in those states, and that helped. And basically what I just described, just breaking down the silos of information, just ends up in certain parts of the country, and unfortunately, we're the victims. We, the retailers, law enforcement, and the criminals keep winning because we're not sharing that critical data. So that's one of the things we did, and I've seen since those times many other agencies at the federal level and the state level amplify those efforts to break down those silos and really just become this coalition of the willing that we like to talk about. So that's from my side.
A little to add on that, I think we're at a really interesting inflection point where there's sufficient proliferation of digital tools now, both on businesses and on the law enforcement side. So we could really start to like connect these two communities together. So it's a very unique moment in time, not just because a lot of these technologies have permeated, like everything from like being able to store large amounts of digital evidence, being able to lift and shift information, to all the AI work that's happening. I think there's a real opportunity here to bring that technology, both the agencies and the retailers and businesses, in a way that just wasn't possible before.
All right, let's take a deeper dive into the law enforcement side of things. So Brian and Fish, we know that a lot of retail crime data exists, but it's often incomplete and disconnected. Why is seeing the full picture so critical for effective investigations?
The reason that we went with Retail Crime Hub was to try and put the pieces together in the region. So we're 25 miles east of Seattle. We have a lot of retail theft in King County, which is the largest county in the state of Washington, most populous, excuse me. And ultimately, our criminals don't live in our city. They live in other cities. They come to ours, take all of our stuff, and then they go somewhere else. We need to be able to put those pictures together, come up with multiple charges because they don't just do it once in one location, and put all those pieces together, give it to the prosecutors, and file actual heavyweight charges versus a misdemeanor here or something like that they could plea out.
It might be helpful to just talk about what the Retail Crime Hub is for some of you who don't know. It's a new capability that we're bringing together, Auror and Axon. Auror has an incredible amount of retail crime data. It's the incident management platform of choice, retail crime intelligence data, and all of that information is siloed and situated in the businesses. And the businesses are taking a lot of painstaking effort to curate that information so that the repeat offenders, that come to the stores and they can identify, who they are and take action. But that information is siloed. And what we're trying to do with this new capability called Retail Crime Hub is bring that data to law enforcement in a way that's really, really simple, in a few clicks, and be able to help law enforcement prioritize so that businesses get the attention they can need, and at the same time law enforcement can really see the patterns of crime that are happening across their communities, and because they're under-resourced, can really focus their time and attention on the most prolific offenders, right? So, and all the way through from law enforcement through prosecution, the dream here is to be able to connect those dots so that, when they eventually get prosecuted, we're going after the worst offenders, and we're also being able to aggregate charges and so on. So we think, these digital tools are really going to help us do that.
The breadth of data is incredible. You all have wonderful teams in each of your organizations that gather this intel every single day, and it might be someone you see once or twice, but law enforcement knows them. And so we're starting to see now not only that we can aggregate cases across all the different retailers to show how prolific they are impacting our communities, but we're also finding that they are engaged in other crimes within our community. So just the other day we had a hit and run, and through the Retail Crime Hub, we were able to identify who was that vehicle and driver because they just happened to commit a retail theft prior to their hit and run. And so we were able to not only identify them, but then charge them with both those crimes. So hopefully we can hold those folks accountable. You saw on the slide at the very beginning of today's presentations that 10% are committing 70% of the crimes. And as soon as we can get that amount of information to not only put those cases together, because sometimes the $50 case, the $100 case either doesn't get picked up for prosecution, or by the time it gets to a judge, your sentence is time served because they went to the jail for 24 hours. When you can start painting that picture of how prolific, how often they do this, commit these crimes, even if it's a lower dollar amount, the judges start to see a different picture. So even with this Retail Crime Hub, you can go back and see all the work all of your folks have been doing for so long, and you might be past time limits to press those charges. But when you go into sentencing, you're like, you have 10 cases before you judge, but here's 175 other cases and instances where this person's not learning how to be a contributing member of society.
You kind of answered my next question as well, which was great. So I want to see if anyone has any adds to this. You touched on the changes that you see when you can connect multiple locations and the activity versus just a single incident. What else do you see when it comes to prosecution or preventing those repeat offenders from entering stores again?
So, for us, we only got onto the Retail Crime Hub in September. And like I said with the intel, it's kind of like having the box top to the puzzle. So each of you all have pieces, and when we can look at that, we can kind of see what the actual picture is. And we see how these folks are interconnected. We can see the vehicles they're interconnected with and other crimes that they're committing outside of necessarily the retail space. We've talked about shoplifting a lot here, but trespass is a huge challenge in retail as well as violence. So we go from shoplifting to robbery with a violent act. And so as we can start to put those cases together to get better prosecutions, I'll just give you an example. We started in September. We had a huge focus on this, and we've had 194 cases that we've investigated now just through this platform. 160 are already through the prosecutorial process, meaning they've already pled, they're being prosecuted, have a court date, and we have 181 total arrests and or warrants. So if you think about the impact that that has and how it's going to have a downward pressure on theft across the space, like I said, I want you all to compete in the public market for customers, not for thieves. You guys are sharing all those already. So if we can start to deal with them.
Never heard it that way, but you're actually right.
Yeah, so if we can start dealing with them, you can get back to your primary business and we can take them out of the picture. But what I just talked about, the loss investigated was $142,000 with the loss, and the prosecuted is $114,000. So that's either recovered and or prosecuted for. So huge impact, and we're only about, 10 weeks into it or so now, 11. And so we're continuing to see the fruits of it, which is why the more folks we have involved, again, we get a better picture of that box top of what the crime's going on in that community. And I believe there's two main focuses for retail, and that's you guys to make a profit and an impact on the communities. And so I think that this helps in both.
And something interesting I learned just recently, a lot of you that use Auror today will know about the direct-to-police reporting functionality, where you can enter an email address and it goes directly to a police officer's inbox. 70% of those go left unread. So with the Retail Crime Hub, it actually goes directly to an inbox where there's a team that can manage it. And so you actually start to get some of the results that we've been talking about versus just being lost in an email inbox. So there's some really interesting results being driven there.
When we looked at the process of how crime reporting happens end-to-end from businesses to law enforcement, each single pain point is sort of a little paper cut, but you can just get buried with this stuff if the tools are really too complicated. So there's a lot of gains to be found. You can see from some of the numbers that you just heard, just by closely connecting the tools, like every simple thing, like I don't have to log into a new system, right? I can use my existing Axon credentials, if you're using evidence.com, to log into Auror and be able to look for the data that you need. And I can push a button to get the evidence that I need. The retailer can they do the investigative work. They make it easy for the PD to be able to assemble the case that they want. With a few clicks, just send it over. We're paying a lot of attention to that to make this stuff easy so that you folks can do, other things that are more value added.
Yeah. One thing I'm really excited about is I work with the retailers and I get to play in the law enforcement side as well, is what if your store in one state has that engagement with a team like Brian's at Anchorage, or pick a state in the US, and then how those criminals are working into interstate. And as the more folks are using the Retail Crime Hub and that operational picture is clear about who's impacting your communities, how can your store information be exchanged as well through your own systems, and then work with your individual police departments and where those stores are at. Because sure, he's talking about one city, you guys have multiple stores in multiple states, sometimes different threats of violence, threats of impact, fraud's heavier in one or the other. That's what we're trying to do is just get you that information as holistically as we can so you can see the full operating picture of criminality in your area you are. And then, make a decision on whether or not that relationship is great with the police, maybe work on that. I'll talk a little bit about that in my other thoughts as we're closing about some of the things we can be doing to kind of make that relationship a little bit closer in just my professional opinion.
So jumping deep into the retail side, what has changed for you when law enforcement can see the patterns across the Auror network instead of just a single affected store?
I work with a lot of the teams from the LE side, and they're still using WhatsApp, we're still using messaging, GroupMe, and obviously you get to a situation where you're working on a prosecution that can be a lot of work thrown out the window when you can't verify how you got the videos. So that for me is probably from being a former law enforcement, making sure that that's rock solid and it's going to sustain a prosecution and all the challenges that are going to come with, putting an officer on a stand or verifying where that evidence came from.
Arjun, how does the Auror and Axon partnership enable faster and stronger investigations than either platform alone?
Yeah, Aura and Axon are sort of kindred spirits. We're kind of coming at this same problem from different angles. At Axon, our missions protect life. We're a public safety company historically, but we're starting to do a lot of interesting things. But it really comes down to where's the life-threatening activities happening? Where's the crime happening? And it's hard to look at the last couple of years and conclude that a big chunk of that is actually happening on businesses, right? Because that's where, criminals end up committing something and then they get caught there, or then they go out and do other things. And so it was natural for us to start to pay attention there. And that's where Aura's Retail Crime Network really comes into play. We have a rich history of working with law enforcement, being able to, have evidence.com, a trusted platform for all the reasons that we just talked about, like digital audit trails, being able to manage incredible amounts of evidence, work with prosecutors, be able to really digitize the justice system. And putting these two together was just really, really, really logical. Most of our customers were telling us how much they love Aura. They're already spending meticulous amounts of time creating the evidence that police would need in their incident management platform, right? So they're putting it in Aura already. We're starting to see the proliferation of body cameras within businesses, and that becomes added evidence, video evidence that retailers are now capturing. We're seeing CCTV footage, and then now the platform's aggregating this information like Aura is doing with common offenders, vehicle license plate reads, and so on and so forth. So when we looked at these two pieces together, it was so logical to connect the two, because we can make everything better by doing this. We can make safer communities, safer public spaces, save police time, save the retailer time. And this is also some of the strengths that we bring to the table, being able to build digital bridges. And so I think that our hope is, the early feedback has been really fantastic. And our hope is that creating that communication channel, a trusted communication channel, reducing all the friction that you would have and being able to look for those patterns. I love that analogy of the box top, the puzzle box top, being able to see that picture. We're really, really optimistic that this can make a big dent on crime.
Now, I know many of you will have a lot of incredible stories from your careers. Raul certainly takes the cake for some very interesting stories, so I recommend pinning him down and getting him to share some stuff. So Raul, thinking about the experiences you've had in your career, can you tell us about a time where access to shared intelligence accelerated an investigation or changed the outcome?
Yeah, I often speak about how humbled we were about the great work that happened in the retail environment before HSI attempted to just help out. But if you look back at organized retail crime and whether the federal agencies were actually doing something about it, you have to go back to 2009, where 3 of the federal agencies testified in Congress about it. And I had to be reminded by some great mentors in the industry, some of them from some of your companies that took me under their wing and said, hey, before the feds were looking at this, we've been looking at it for many, many years. And one of the cases that comes into play is a big case in Chicago that happened about 3.5, 4 years ago. And what it was is what I described earlier. We took information, the federal government did, DHS, vetted it out with a couple other agencies on some of the main targets operating in Chicago. And then we used that information and gave it back to the retailers in conjunction with law enforcement in that region. It ended up becoming a 4-state takedown. And I'll just quote a couple of the stats that came from some of the players that are in this room. 4 or 5 box trucks of loaded merchandise that was identified. Search warrants with SRT teams on national news media. An airplane was seized in another state that was associated with this criminal network. And then the aftermath of trying to seize the funds of the criminals in other states is what actually really impressed me, because it ended up being, like I said, a 4-state takedown, but it wouldn't have happened if it had not been for the retailers to bring it to the feds, then having the ability to say, hey, we're not going to just take over, we're going to partner up with you, go back to the state's attorneys. 2 of the famous attorneys in the middle of the United States, my good friends, Dant and Mike, who, if you don't know them, they wake up and dream in money laundering. They make a joke about how they love seizing money. And that's what it took. It took us to look at it from another lens, and that was a huge, impactful case. It was on the national news, and I'm not going to mention the retailers, you know who you are. There was a lot of them operating in that takedown, and it made me believe, look, we can look at it from a different lens, and we can make a bigger impact if we can share that information and not try to be an agency that's going to take all the credit.
We're going to move now to crime beyond retail incidents. So I'll head to Brian and Fish. Retail crime doesn't exist in isolation. How has access to the retail intelligence helped surface broader criminal behavior or patterns outside of retail?
I already spoke a little bit about it for where we picked up a hit and run. We've also got eludings. I can foresee this information being super helpful when we get to homicide cases, as well as more sensitive and rapidly evolving, such as Amber Alerts or Silver Alerts, which thankfully don't happen with high frequency in my city, but I can definitely see how all of those tools will play into that. Again, these high-level crimes, they're off guard when they're walking through the store, and they're on guard when they're committing the crimes outside of them. So we can kind of get the idea of associations as well as timelines with that information.
Just a little spin from my perspective. I just want more retailers and more agencies to share information through Retail Crime Hub. It's been spoken about with siloed information and things like that, and if loss prevention is filing information and it goes nowhere, then nobody can act on it. They're keeping internal records, police departments can't access it. Retailers may share information with their other partners, but again, law enforcement doesn't have it. So we need more and more retailers and more agencies sharing information this way in order to put the complete picture together.
One of the really interesting stories in New Zealand many years ago now, there was a devastating terrorist attack in Christchurch. And because New Zealand has so many LPR cameras throughout the whole country, police were able to tap into all the LPR cameras and track his movements in the days prior to the attack. And that significantly changed the outcome of the investigation and how it resulted. So I know that with more LPR and facial recognition that rolls out across the Auror network in the US and Canada, there'll be a lot more of those same outcomes. So we'll stick with you two as well. Beyond solving individual cases faster, how has building intelligence network with your retail partners impacted your department strategy and your relationships with the community?
Ours is a little bit more of a projection. We assume that this is going to help reduce crime in the region, but it also demonstrates to the public that we are doing something about it. A lot of things, especially during COVID era, was reported as store takeovers and large amounts of theft, and nobody really followed up on it. At least in the general media, they never reported the follow-up. So we want to demonstrate that, we're putting things together and we are actually going to pursue criminals and try and break up the rest of the crimes that they do, funded with the theft.
Yeah, I mean, we went very public with this out of the gate when we knew this was coming on board, kind of assembled the team to get them familiar with it, and then we started launching a PR campaign almost to let the criminals know we're coming. And we assembled a list through the Retail Crime Hub of our top 20 offenders by dollar amount and our top 20 offenders by incidents. And then we went after all of them and either got warrants or arrested them. So if you think about that, again, that 10% and 70 number, those should automatically have a significant impact. Again, by being able to see multiple thefts across multiple retailers, we have an aggregate law in Alaska, so we can get to a felony level on smaller cases, depending on how many incidents there are. So getting the district attorneys on board was a big step to prosecute those cases, which they are. And so we have gone to more grand juries as of recent time than before. Well, most of those cases would go into an online reporting system. You would have information in your system, we'd have information in our system, and relatively nothing was being done with either of those things. When you start to see that box top and you start to see those impacts, the $35 theft is like, it's probably not worth our time to even go down that road on either side. But as it aggregates, you're like, well, this is more interesting and probably worth my while to hold this person accountable because it's actually going to save me money in the long run. I will also tell you, when it comes to information sharing, when we're talking here, we're not talking about that 7-year-old that stole a candy bar, right? We're talking about brazen thieves. And those brazen thieves communicate, and they know your policies shortly after you put them out. So they know what employee is going to stop them. And I think that's actually one of the reasons we start to see some of these violent encounters, is because it's almost so shocking to them that they get questioned and or someone trying to stop them because they're so used to doing it with impunity. And so I think that there's definitely some shared risk, and I think Auror kind of brings some of this together where we can identify them, go get warrants, and kind of get them outside of your stores so that you don't have to necessarily have those confrontations, but also that they're fully aware of what's going to happen. You put an armed guard in there, they know what the policy is for that armed guard. They know what the policy is for your security. That's why loss prevention is such a shock to them when they can actually put handcuffs on them. So again, I think there's a broader picture here. We think stuff's siloed. That's not in the criminal realm, and this kind of brings a lot of that information together on the home team side so that we can deal with that.
Right, I'd like to move into trust, guardrails, and responsible use. So Arjun and Raul, some retailers worry about how law enforcement uses shared data. What guardrails exist, and how does responsible use actually work in practice?
Yeah, I'll go first, and then I'll kick it over to my brother. So it starts with privacy by design, and we work directly in with you guys, your retail. This is your data, so obviously we have to make sure that you're comfortable with what you want to share. Besides all that, the auditable, it's audited, secure sign-ons, figuring out who has access, all that comes into play as well. And the training that goes with getting the platform ready to go. You know, we're not just signing up law enforcement officers and not working with them. We have a hand-to-glove, white glove service with these folks, constantly doing trainings, answering questions, working with some of the larger organized retail crime task forces out there, and really trying to answer those questions from the beginning. And then again, just coming back to you so you can work with your privacy, your legal teams, and saying, all right, how are we going to jurisdictionally share this information? Because in the end, it's sitting in your coffers anyway. You're either going to hand it as a onesies and twosies with PDFs or thumb drives. Let's figure out a way that we can get this on a larger scale where it shows them the full picture of what's happening in that city. And then work with the engagement at the senior executive level between your stores or at your levels with those leaders in that community. And let's see if we can open that up a little bit for better sharing. So that's how we look at it at Auror.
You know, I'll speak to a little bit about how the system is kind of just designed. Like, we have a lot of history in helping design these secure systems that are also easy to use, that pass the test of the criminal justice system, right? And what's really great about this situation, where you have all of the retail crime intelligence data in one platform, and then you have the law enforcement and evidence management on the other platform, is we can build really tight interlocks, and we can do it in a way that dramatically reduces the laborious nature of exchanging information. But those interlocks and exchanging information digitally just intrinsically makes it more auditable, right? Because if you're exchanging information outside of digital systems, or you're lifting and shifting information, that's actually less auditable and less secure by design than doing it this way. And so everything from being able to take your Axon credential and being able to use that as a way to audit what's happening in Aura. So if you look at the audit trail, it will tell you clearly what was accessed, when it was accessed, who accessed it. So there's a very, very clear set of breadcrumbs that you can look at to see what happened. And the reverse is true as well. The retailer has very tight controls on what is shared, how it's shared, how long it's shared. So the system is more secure and less laborious, which is the best possible situation that you can think of.
Right. And then Brian and Fish, how do you validate and corroborate retail intelligence before acting on it?
I was going to say, we're new to this retail crime hub. We don't take any of it at face value. We're going to interrogate the information. So sometimes LPs or APs misidentify a person, and so we'll work to correct that based on the information we have. So we're going to validate that, because we're going to take this case to court is the goal, or have them plead out, which is even better. But so we are looking at each of those pieces of information to verify and validate it, and also sharing information across. So they might have committed some type of theft or trespass at one retail location that identified them with a driver's license. We corroborated that, but they have also been across town at a different retailer wreaking havoc, and they don't know who they are. Now we can actually tell them who they are. They can build their cases, and so that we can compile those together. So we definitely independently validate all the information that's been brought over, which again takes a little bit of time. But now that we're not driving to the stores, trying to find somebody that cares about whatever we're there for, and then gathering that evidence, we can use that time where it's already delivered to us in a package to then validate it, reach back out to the retailers to kind of shore up some of those pieces of evidence to make sure we have a quality case.
So wrapping up, looking ahead, what advice would you give to retailers who want stronger law enforcement partnerships?
The number one thing you do, whether you're an Aura customer or not, is reach out to your law enforcement partners in those communities and meet with them. They have a very different perspective of your store than you probably do. I mean, I have data on all the calls for service, every time you called me, what you called us for, why you called us, if it was value of time expended at your store, or if it was a waste of time. We have something we call a nuisance ordinance in Anchorage. And so if you get over 100 nuisance calls to your store, we'll send you a bill. And what I mean by nuisance calls is you might actually had something occur, like a trespass, called for the police, and then that associate went on with their day, back to work, probably punched out or something. The police come and they're like, hey, we're here for the trespass. And they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. That'd be a nuisance call. because there might have been something there, but the store has taken no steps to share that information with us. And so by engaging with your law enforcement partners before you get to that point, we can help walk you through how to do this so that we have the information or put it in the retail crime hub. That's a huge repository of trespasses. So not only when we get a shoplift, we'll also have a violation of the trespass. So now there's 2 charges. And as the criminal justice system works and those charges stack, it not only creates more time, but it's also creates more likely to have a plea agreement. And if you partner with those local law enforcement and start an actual push on this, again, your criminal community will get the hint that at your store, they're going to get prosecuted. They get the hint.
Thank you, Brian. Arjun, what does this look like in 2 years if we get it right?
Look, hopefully we're all going to make a big dent on crime, right? And that our communities get safer, workers feel safer in businesses. What we'd all really like is a smooth process where there's a closed loop. And just like, what we're saying is we want to put a penalty back into the system, and we want to be able to do that in a way that's, dramatically less friction than exists today. And that's the way we're going to solve it. We're going to solve with intelligence. We're going to solve with giving the right tools, connecting the dots, going after the worst offenders, and putting a cost back into the crime, and completing that full feedback loop so that all the way through prosecution, we're able to send that message. And if Axon and Auror are able to do that, then I think in a few years we'll see dramatic improvements into our customers' lives and for our communities.
And then finally, Raul, what's the one thing retailers, law enforcement, and tech providers each need to do to make that future real?
So I think the first thing is remembering that we're all doing this because of the safety of the employees, the safety of the shoppers. So we pay a lot of respect to the fact that your teams are doing it every day. And that's why Auror exists, first and foremost. Not only is it a continuous problem with violence, but then you add in the law enforcement piece, it's dangerous to them. So hopefully that continues to reduce because of the willingness to share, the willingness to think outside the box, the willingness to take the lead, even if you're one small organization or you're a store of all over the country, going back and looking at it from another perspective and looking at the next trends like the digital fraud space and paying attention to the hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that are being impacted through gift card fraud and a litany of other ways that you get scammed, and you guys all know what I'm talking about. It's going back to your organization, and if you identify that threat, sharing it with your counterparts at your largest trade shows and your largest conferences. You guys are all the senior leaders. I've met a lot of you, learned a lot of this from you guys, and I'll leave you with the story of why there is a gift card fraud alliance. It is because a retailer was strong enough to invite law enforcement to see the problem that was impacting their overall enterprise, having the ability to go to their lawyers and their teams and say, we're going to share this to other retailers and see if they were impacted. And it was. And then that, with a momentum shift of getting other entities, banks, payment-to-payment systems, and others that we might not have invited to this fight, has now created this national gift card fraud alliance that started with a couple retailers and some law enforcement folks 4 years ago. I had the privilege of being in the first meeting and then seeing it to make a change for the better. That now we're talking about it in Australia, in the UK, New Zealand, and hopefully here paying attention to that next threat, like the crazy things that are happening today where drones are being dropped in prisons and criminals on cell phones are calling your store associates and normal Americans to getting them to create a fraud incident by dropping money in crypto or buying gift card fraud. That is a true story, ladies and gentlemen, that is happening today in the American justice system. So Google Georgia Penitentiary and you'll see they've seized more drones than any other penitentiary because that's what's happening right under our noses. So long story is, be willing to share the information, look at the threats, and then join that coalition of the willing to do more and then share that information. So
it's not Axon drones.
No, but they're helping with taking care of the bad ones.
It can't be everywhere.
When I read that article, I'm like, there's no way this is, oh yeah, it's real. There's a lot of drones.
You can track them, you just can't take them
We
down.
can't take him down.
Cool. Any questions for our panelists? Yes.
So, Raul, I just want to double down on something you said earlier, stating the obvious a little bit, but you talked about investigating and then sharing back. And when law enforcement is sharing back with retailers, it gives us the opportunity to maybe prioritize our resources or even offer up capacity and resources, either personnel or monitoring and so forth. So,
Yeah. A lot of that, Dan, has to come to like that responsibility of leadership at the local levels and having the willingness of folks in your position and some of the teams that you lead to going out there and hold accountability on the law enforcement side as well. Now that I've been on both sides, there is accountability. They're not all in it for just giving feedback, and I think that's a critical point, that law enforcement has to do that with your, at least at the executive levels where you sit, not so much always on the store to store because it's so busy, but it's a great point. And we heard it often when we were leading that initiative and saying, you can't just hoard the information and not tell us what happened with it.
Great. Give it up for our panel. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Retail Crime Intelligence podcast by Aura. Don't forget to follow and subscribe on your favorite podcast app.